Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back into medieval times. Not to admire castles or kings, but to face the harsh, raw truth of what it really meant to start a family back then. Life was brutal, fragile, and full of dangers most of us can barely imagine today. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I bring here. And don't forget to drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to connect with all of you worldwide. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's slowly step into this story together. Most mothers gave birth without a doctor. In the ancient world, new life arrived on a knife's edge between hope and terror. For most mothers, the moment of birth was not a gentle welcome, but a test of fate. Faced without a doctor, without any medical certainty, and with only a circle of women, a handful of herbs, and a flood of whispered prayers. There were no modern hospitals, no beeping monitors, no trained surgeons waiting with steady hands and silver tools. For most of history, childbirth was a domestic ritual, a communal act, performed in bedrooms, kitchens, or stables, with the air thick with fear and anticipation. When a woman's time came, she was surrounded not by doctors, but by midwives. And in the world of ancient Rome, Greece, India, China, almost anywhere you look, these midwives were not medical professionals. They were wise women, neighbors, or relatives, chosen for their experience or reputation, not for training. The knowledge they possessed was handed down like secret recipes, learned from mothers and grandmothers, not from textbooks. They relied on instinct, folklore, and faith. Some had attended dozens of births. Others had learned only by watching and surviving. They prepared the birthing room with cloths and oil lamps, boiled water, and herbs believed to ease pain or speed delivery. Laurel leaves, myrrh, pennyroyal, and more, each with its own legend, its own promise. But when things went wrong, the world turned dark. There were no forceps, no C-sections, no anesthesia. If labor stalled, if the baby was turned the wrong way, if bleeding started, there was little the midwife could do. Some tried to reposition the child with their hands. Some used herbal poultices or whispered charms to coax luck into the room. But if a complication became deadly, hope was all that remained. In those moments, prayers grew frantic, and the house fell silent. Neighbors waited outside, listening for a baby's cry, or the absence of one. Every birth was a gamble. Maternal mortality was high, so was infant mortality. It wasn't unusual for women to bear 5, 10, even 15 children, only to see many of them die before their 5th birthday. Every mother knew the risks. Every family carried the scars. Fathers often waited in other rooms, powerless, pacing, counting the hours. There was nothing they could do but trust the midwives and hope that the gods, or fate, or fortune, would be kind. And sometimes, when the pain became too much, or the outcome seemed hopeless, there were darker options. Opium for the pain, sometimes even to hasten death, amulets to ward off evil spirits, even sacrifices offered to ancient gods or ancestors, anything to turn luck their way. In the rare households that could afford them, a doctor might be called, but Roman and Greek doctors had little more to offer. Their understanding of anatomy was crude, their treatments sometimes dangerous. Many believed illness was caused by imbalances in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, or by the displeasure of gods. Bleeding, purging, or frightening superstitions sometimes made things worse, not better. So, the midwife remained the anchor, the only comfort, the only authority in a storm of uncertainty. If a birth was successful, she was praised, even honored with gifts or a feast. If it ended in tragedy, she wept with the family, mourned the loss, and carried the weight of another life slipped through her hands. Yet there was strength in this ancient sisterhood. Midwives were often the most respected women in their communities. They understood life and death, risk and resilience, the secrets of women's bodies, and the wisdom of generations. They shared in the laughter of new mothers, the first cries of the newborn, the mourning songs of the bereaved. In their hands, humanity survived. Today, we take for granted the science, safety, and certainty of modern medicine. But the story of childbirth is still a story of courage, of facing the unknown, of hope in the face of risk. When we remember the mothers who birthed alone, the midwives who worked miracles with nothing but knowledge and love, we remember the fragility and the strength at the root of every human story. Because every life that arrived in that world, without a doctor, without a guarantee, was a testament not just to survival, but to the enduring spirit of mothers and the quiet heroes who guided them through the darkness. 1 in 3 children died before age 5. In the shadows of ancient cities and villages, behind the grand temples and bustling markets, a quiet tragedy unfolded daily, one that shaped the very fabric of human existence for millennia. It was the death of children, not a rare occurrence, not a distant horror, but an unrelenting, merciless certainty. 1 in 3 children never reached their 5th birthday. This was the brutal reality of life before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before vaccines. Infection, malnutrition, and disease stalked every home, every cradle. And for most families, the loss was not a question of if, but when. In the earliest days of life, vulnerability was at its peak. Newborns, tiny, fragile, barely breathing, were exposed to a world teeming with invisible threats. Bacteria in the water, parasites in the soil, viruses carried by flies or the simplest touch. Every breath, every drop of milk, every breath carried risk. The ancient Romans, like many before and after them, lived with this shadow over their households. Medical knowledge was limited, often mixed with superstition and ritual. Midwives and healers did their best, but their tools were crude. Herbs and poultices, prayers and incantations, a delicate balance between hope and despair. The result was heartbreak. So widespread was this tragedy that families rarely named their children immediately. A baby might be called the little one, or the one not yet named, a reflection of the grim uncertainty hanging over their survival. Naming was a ritual, a formal acceptance of a child's place in the family and society, but only bestowed after the baby passed the critical threshold of infancy. Until then, parents held their breath, avoided attachments, protected themselves from grief. This was not emotional coldness. It was survival. To love a child who might soon be gone was a torment too great. To bind a name to a soul unsteady on the edge of life was a gamble no parent wanted to lose. And yet, the ache of loss was universal. Tombstones for infants show names carved in stone, sometimes alongside pleas for peace, for mercy, for remembrance. What claimed these young lives so relentlessly? The causes were many, and often invisible. Diseases like measles, whooping cough, and smallpox tore through communities without mercy. Diarrheal diseases, born of contaminated water and poor sanitation, were killers beyond understanding. Pneumonia and tuberculosis crept through the lungs of children whose bodies lacked the strength to fight back. Malnutrition weakened defenses. In times of famine or war, when food was scarce or spoiled, the smallest mouths suffered most. Vitamin deficiencies and starvation left infants vulnerable to every tiny pathogen, every microscopic invader. Mothers faced impossible odds. Breastfeeding was the best defense, but even that was complicated by poor maternal health or social constraints. Wet nurses, often slaves or poor women, were employed, sometimes beneficial, sometimes detrimental, because the survival of the child depended on the strength of the mother's body and milk. This was not just biology. It was social tragedy. Infant mortality shaped family structures, inheritance laws, even cultural rituals. The grief of losing a child was woven into religion and art, into poetry and law. Some cultures placed special emphasis on memorializing children. Others tried to shield themselves through stoic acceptance or ritual purification. Yet amid this darkness, life persisted. Families grew resilient. Communities formed support networks. Midwives became revered figures. Prayers to gods of healing, like Asclepius, or protective deities, like Fortuna and Juno, were whispered fervently. And every birth was a miracle, a momentary triumph against the odds. The toll of losing a third of all children before age 5 was a force that shaped humanity's story. It influenced migrations, population growth, family planning, and even early medicine. It fueled innovations in hygiene, childbirth practices, and nutrition that slowly chipped away at the mortality rates across centuries. But for every child lost, a family bore the scars forever. So when we think of the past, of ancient Rome, or any civilization long gone, we must remember this unseen sorrow. Behind every statue, every monument, every story of conquest and glory, lay thousands of silent graves, graves of children too young to speak, too fragile to survive. Their absence shaped the future as much as any emperor's decree or battle won. They remind us how precious life truly is, and how far humanity has come in the struggle to protect it. Because the legacy of that harsh past is still with us, in the way we love, protect, and cherish the smallest lives among us today. Fathers often outlived multiple wives and children. In the vast expanse of ancient Rome's history, amid its towering monuments and sprawling forums, lies a quieter, more tragic story. One etched not in marble or bronze, but in the grief of countless fathers who outlived the very families they created. To the modern eye, the Roman family might seem stable, a patriarchal institution with clear roles and legacies. But beneath the surface of this image was a harsh reality shaped by the brutal conditions of childbirth and childhood survival. Fathers frequently buried more than one wife, and many mourned multiple children who never reached adulthood. The dangers of childbirth in ancient Rome were relentless and unyielding. Without modern medicine, every pregnancy was a perilous gamble. Midwives wielded knowledge passed down through generations, but their tools were rudimentary, and infection was a constant threat. Mothers often labored in unsanitary conditions, with no antibiotics to stem the bleeding or fight disease. Complications such as obstructed labor, hemorrhage, and sepsis claimed lives frequently. Some estimates suggest maternal mortality rates in Rome could be as high as 10 to 15% per birth, shocking by today's standards, but grimly normal then. Roman men, often marrying women several years younger, witnessed this danger repeatedly. It was common for a father to marry again, sometimes 2 or 3 times, as wives died bearing children. Each new marriage brought hope and fear. The ritual of wedding was intertwined with prayers to protect the bride and unborn child, but no blessing could guarantee survival. Cemeteries tell silent stories of women who died in their 20s or 30s, their graves clustered in family plots, testaments to lives cut short by the very act of bringing life into the world. And even for those women who survived childbirth, the perils for their children were immense. Infant mortality was staggering. Ancient texts and archaeological evidence suggest that as many as 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. Diseases we now consider preventable, measles, smallpox, dysentery, raged unchecked. Malnutrition, parasites, and poor sanitation only worsened the toll. For a Roman father, the joy of seeing a child born was tempered by the dread of what might come next. Fathers often outlived sons and daughters alike. Inscriptions on tombstones reveal heartbreaking dedications to children who died at ages ranging from infancy to adolescence. The loss was a shared experience across social classes. Senators mourned heirs lost to fevers. Slaves grieved children who succumbed to hunger. While the elite might have had access to better food and shelter, disease and death were great equalizers. No household was immune. This recurring cycle of loss shaped Roman attitudes toward family and legacy. Children were precious but fragile investments. Adoption was common, often to secure an heir when biological children did not survive. Some men chose to marry multiple times, not just for love or alliance, but to ensure offspring would live to carry on the family name. Widowers remarried quickly, driven by social and economic necessity as much as desire. The emotional burden on fathers was immense, but often unspoken. Roman culture prized stoicism and public strength. Mourning rituals existed but were tightly controlled. Public displays of grief were acceptable for close kin, but fathers were expected to channel their sorrow into duty, maintaining the household, honoring the dead with proper rites, and preparing for the future. The loss of a child was a wound that never fully healed, but had to be carried silently, like a shadow behind the triumphs and tragedies of Roman life. Yet this harsh reality also fostered resilience. Families found ways to celebrate the short lives they were granted. Festivals included prayers for children's health. Homes displayed charms and amulets against evil spirits thought to cause illness. Mothers sang lullabies filled with hope, and fathers recited ancestral tales to inspire strength. Even as death hovered close, life pressed on. In the end, the story of Roman fathers outliving wives and children is a testament to human endurance in the face of relentless loss. It reminds us that beneath the empire's glory lay countless private tragedies, quiet battles fought in the home, where love was fierce and grief was profound. These men bore the weight of survival, of memory, and of hope for a legacy that might one day outlast them all. Giving birth at home was mandatory and risky. In ancient Rome, the miracle of birth was far from the sterile, controlled environment we imagine today. Hospitals, as we know them, simply did not exist. Instead, childbirth was an intensely private, often dangerous affair, taking place within the cramped and unsanitary confines of a woman's own home. For Roman women, giving birth was both a mandatory rite and a gamble with death, a risk not just for themselves, but for their newborns as well. The process began quietly, usually with a midwife or obstetrix summoned from the neighborhood. These women were experienced, respected, and often wise, but their tools and knowledge were limited by the era's medical understanding. Without anesthesia, antibiotics, or antiseptic practices, even the simplest complication could become fatal. The home setting, while familiar, offered little protection against infection. Floors were dirt or rough stone. Chambers were cramped and poorly ventilated, and clean water was scarce. Roman houses, insulae for the poor, domus for the wealthy, were rarely designed with childbirth in mind. Rooms were shared by families, often with many people living under one roof. Privacy was a luxury, not a given. A woman might labor on a mattress laid on the floor, surrounded by relatives or servants who offered prayers, herbs, or charms. The ancient Romans believed in spiritual protections as much as physical care. Amulets hung around the mother's neck, prayers whispered to the goddess Juno Lucina, protector of childbirth. Despite these rituals, mortality rates were staggering. It is estimated that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth in ancient times. Causes ranged from hemorrhaging and obstructed labor to postpartum infections, what we now recognize as puerperal fever. These infections were caused by bacteria introduced through unwashed hands, dirty cloths, or unsanitary instruments. Without sterile conditions, even a small tear in the birth canal could become deadly. The newborn faced equal peril. Many infants did not survive beyond their first weeks. Premature births, malnutrition, and infection took their toll. Infant mortality was a harsh reality woven into Roman life. Families accepted these losses with stoic resignation, often offering prayers or sacrifices to appease the gods and ensure future fertility. The survival of mother and child was never guaranteed. It was a fragile victory in a dangerous world. The wealthy could afford some advantages. They might employ a highly skilled midwife or have access to better hygiene through access to clean water and heated rooms. Occasionally, wealthy families summoned physicians who practiced rudimentary obstetrics, attempting interventions such as turning a breech baby or manually assisting delivery. Yet, even the best medical knowledge of the day was primitive, and many physicians were more harmful than helpful, often using risky procedures or potions. For the majority, the poor and enslaved women, childbirth was even grimmer. They lacked privacy, comfort, and proper care. Enslaved women were often forced to deliver in the same conditions as their masters, but without any of the protections. Their health was considered secondary, and their babies were often taken from them at birth to be raised as property or laborers. The emotional trauma added to the physical danger. Moreover, childbirth had broader social and economic implications. A mother's ability to survive and bear children was tied to family lineage, inheritance, and social status. Sons were especially prized, destined to carry the family name and property forward. Failure to produce healthy offspring could result in social stigma or worse. Women were pressured to endure the ordeal silently, their pain masked by expectation. Despite these dangers, childbirth remained a communal event. Midwives formed networks, passing knowledge orally across generations. Women shared remedies, lamentations, and hopes. Religious festivals honored fertility and safe delivery, reflecting the precarious balance between life and death. Even in suffering, Roman women found strength in ritual, community, and the fierce will to survive. In the end, childbirth in ancient Rome was a testament to endurance against overwhelming odds. It was an intimate struggle fought without the safety nets modern medicine provides. A mother's courage, a midwife's care, and a community's prayers were the only shields against the relentless shadow of mortality. Every successful birth was a small triumph, a fragile thread woven into the vast tapestry of Roman life. Breastfeeding could kill if done by a stranger. Breastfeeding was once regarded as the most natural and sacred act between a mother and her child, a symbol of life's purest nourishment. Yet in ancient Rome, beneath the surface of this seemingly simple bond, lurked a hidden danger, one that could snuff out the fragile lives of infants in a cruel twist of fate. For wealthy Roman families, the practice of hiring wet nurses was common, a necessity driven by social status, health, or convenience. But this reliance on strangers' milk was fraught with peril. What seemed like an act of care could, and often did, become a silent killer. In Rome's elite circles, childbirth and early infancy were perilous times. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all children born did not survive past their first year. Among the myriad causes, poor sanitation, infectious diseases, malnutrition. A significant and tragic factor was the transmission of deadly illnesses through breast milk. Unlike today, where the mechanisms of disease transmission are well understood, ancient Romans had little knowledge of microbes or infection. To them, milk was pure, and wet nurses were trusted caregivers. But behind this trust hid unseen dangers. Wet nurses were usually slaves or lower-class women hired to breastfeed the children of noble households. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It allowed mothers to recover from childbirth, maintain their social engagements, or conceive again more quickly, which was politically advantageous. The wet nurse became a critical figure, a bridge between class boundaries, providing what was deemed the best nourishment for the infant. Yet, these women came from vastly different backgrounds, often with poor living conditions, exposure to diseases, and limited medical care themselves. Diseases such as tuberculosis, syphilis, and various bacterial infections could be passed from wet nurse to infant through the milk or close contact during feeding. Unfortunately, many wet nurses were carriers of these infections, either visibly ill or asymptomatic. The infants, with their immature immune systems, were tragically vulnerable. Symptoms like fever, diarrhea, respiratory distress, or failure to thrive were often attributed to natural weakness or fate, rather than the source of the nurse's milk. Roman medical writers like Celsus and Galen documented infant illnesses and general hygiene, but there was no consensus or effective intervention to prevent transmission via breastfeeding. The practice continued largely unchecked because it was embedded in social customs and economic realities. For the wealthy, delegating breastfeeding was a sign of status. For wet nurses, it was a livelihood. No one understood the deadly link. The consequences were devastating. In some noble families, entire lineages suffered losses traced back to wet nurses. Yet, without the ability to diagnose or trace infection, blame was diffuse. Mothers might be accused of negligence or curses. Wet nurses were sometimes dismissed or replaced without understanding the root cause. The deaths were silent tragedies, recorded sparsely, but echoing through funerary inscriptions and rare medical treatises. Interestingly, some Roman texts hint at attempts to select wet nurses carefully. Preference was given to young, healthy women, preferably those who had recently born healthy children themselves. Still, this precaution was inadequate. Illnesses like tuberculosis were rampant in the crowded, unsanitary urban environments where many wet nurses lived, making it nearly impossible to guarantee safety. The Romans understood hygiene only superficially, focusing on baths and cleanliness rituals that did little to prevent microbial spread. Moreover, wet nurses' diets and health were often poor, further compromising the quality of milk. Malnutrition, stress, and exposure to pollutants could alter milk composition, weakening infants' nutrition and immune response. The wet nurse-child bond, while intimate, became a conduit for disease rather than protection. Some historians argue that the dangers of wet nursing contributed indirectly to the rise of alternative infant feeding practices, including early attempts at artificial feeding using animal milk or mixtures of bread soaked in milk or water. However, these alternatives brought their own risks, and none matched the nutritional benefits of breast milk, reinforcing reliance on wet nurses despite the hazards. This paradox, where the life-giving act of breastfeeding could become lethal when performed by a stranger, exposes the precarious nature of infant care in ancient Rome. It illustrates a society caught between tradition and the harsh realities of public health, a civilization advancing in law and engineering, yet blind to invisible threats that claimed its youngest members. In reflecting on this, we see how far medical science has come, transforming what was once a hidden peril into a focus of public health and preventive care. But the Roman story remains a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the unseen dangers that once lurked in the most intimate acts of nurturing. You had to feed your children with moldy bread. Picture the world not as a place of abundance, but as a battlefield against hunger. a world where every meal is a question mark, and every bite could be a blessing or a curse. For millions throughout history, especially the poor, survival meant more than finding food. It meant enduring what food became when hope and harvest ran out. Stale crusts, spoiled porridge, mold growing in the shadows of damp, crumbling walls. Bread was life. But for most families, fresh bread was a rare luxury, reserved for the tables of the rich or for festival days that came and went too quickly. For everyone else, bread meant something harder, cheaper, rougher, made from coarse grains, often mixed with weeds, seeds, or scraps swept from mill floors. It was baked in bulk, then left to sit, rationed day by day until the last crust was so hard it could chip a tooth. There was no refrigeration, no preservatives, only the hope that tomorrow would be drier than today, or that the gods might spare a little sunlight to keep the loaves from turning green. But the weather rarely cooperated. In wet seasons, rain seeped through thatched roofs and pooled in corners. Food stores turned musty. Bread, porridge, grain, anything meant to fill an empty stomach became breeding grounds for mold. The kind of mold that festered in the dark, invisible until it burst into color. Blue, white, black, or poisonous green. Mothers and fathers knew the danger. They cut away the worst parts, scraped mold from the surface, hoping it was enough. But often, it wasn't. The poison ran deeper, hiding where no knife could reach. Still, when hunger gnawed and children cried, there was no real choice. Moldy bread was better than nothing. It was a terrible calculation, risking sickness for a moment of relief, trading future pain for a night without hunger. Children ate what they were given. Some grew pale and thin, their bellies swollen not with satisfaction, but with infection. Stomach cramps came next, then fever, vomiting, and sometimes convulsions. Families watched helplessly as their youngest faded before their eyes. They had names for it: bread sickness, bad stomach, the wasting. They prayed it would pass, but sometimes it ended in silence, another tiny grave at the edge of the village. And the mold didn't just poison bodies, it poisoned hope. A mother's guilt, a father's shame, the unspoken understanding that sometimes the only thing you could offer your child was a meal that might kill them. Neighbors whispered. Some accused each other of neglect, others of witchcraft, but all of them knew the truth. It was poverty, not malice, that starved their children. As the years passed, the problem grew worse in times of famine or war. Armies stripped fields bare, leaving behind nothing but spoiled grain and empty barns. Markets became dangerous, bread prices soared, and moldy loaves became the currency of survival. In desperation, families soaked old bread in water or milk, boiled it into thin porridge, or flavored it with bitter herbs to mask the taste of rot. Some tried to make a joke of it, turning hardship into ritual, sharing stories of the toughest crusts or the strangest flavors. But the laughter was thin. There were those who survived, who grew stronger from hardship, who learned to make the most of little. Some ancient healers even believed a little mold could cure wounds, a strange foreshadowing of medicines yet to come. But for most, moldy bread was just another reminder that life was fragile, and hunger cruel. Today, we throw away food at the first sign of staleness. We worry about sell-by dates and health codes, and the idea of feeding a child moldy bread is unthinkable. But for centuries, that was reality, a daily test of sacrifice and endurance, a quiet tragedy repeated in countless homes across countless generations. The story of moldy bread is the story of survival against the odds, of love measured not in gifts, but in desperate choices, of families who clung to each other even as they faded. Because in the end, bread was never just bread. It was hope, memory, regret, and the fragile thread that tied a family to the world. And for those who endured the mold, it was a bitter lesson. Sometimes, to keep your children alive, you had to risk everything. Even the food meant to save them. A mother's death meant babies rarely survived. In the ancient world, life was a fragile thread, especially for the youngest and most vulnerable. But no bond was more vital, more immediate, or more desperate than that between a mother and her newborn child. The mother was the child's first shelter, first comfort, first sustenance. And when she died, often in the agonizing hours of childbirth, her child's chances of survival plummeted almost to zero. Childbirth in antiquity was perilous. Without modern medicine, without antiseptics, without safe surgical interventions, every birth was a gamble against death. Many women bled uncontrollably. Many succumbed to infection, exhaustion, or hemorrhage. When a mother perished, the tragedy echoed beyond her own life, reverberating into the fragile life she had just brought into the world. For a newborn, a mother was everything. Her milk was the only food the baby could digest, rich in nutrients and antibodies that no other food could replace. Her warmth was a shield against the cold. Her care was the gentle touch that calmed the infant's restless cries. When that was lost, the infant was left exposed to starvation, hypothermia, and neglect. In some wealthy Roman households, a solution existed: a wet nurse. These women, often slaves or lower-class mothers who had recently birthed their own healthy babies, were hired to breastfeed infants whose mothers could not. But wet nurses were expensive, and not every family could afford one. For most, the death of a mother meant the death of her baby. The bond between mother and child was more than biology. It was survival. Historical accounts, from the writings of Soranus to Pliny the Elder, acknowledge this grim reality. Midwives were trained not only to assist in birth, but also to prepare families for the possibility of tragedy. They sometimes advised placing the newborn with another nursing woman quickly, or supplementing with animal milk, though this was far from ideal. In many cases, infants left without maternal care faded within weeks. The emotional toll was devastating. Mothers who survived childbirth lived with the constant fear that death might snatch them away, dooming their children to a perilous fate. Fathers, often powerless in infant care, had to entrust their newborns to servants, relatives, or strangers, hoping for the best. This harsh truth influenced Roman family structures and societal norms. Adoption was common, as families sought to preserve lineage. Child mortality shaped inheritance laws. Children had to survive beyond certain ages to be recognized as heirs. Public health was rudimentary, but the loss of mothers and infants was a crisis that echoed through generations. In the poorer quarters of Rome, where crowded insulae and poor sanitation exacerbated risks, the death of a mother almost certainly meant the death of her child. Without milk, without care, and often without shelter, newborns faced a merciless world. Some accounts tell of infants abandoned or sent to foster care, where survival was no better guaranteed. The cycle was brutal. A mother's death was both an end and a beginning, the end of one life, the beginning of another's struggle for existence. Yet, despite this, life persisted. Roman medicine slowly advanced. Midwives and doctors experimented with remedies. Communities developed support systems. Families found ways to care for orphans. The persistence of life against overwhelming odds shaped the resilience of a civilization. So, when we look back at the grandeur of ancient Rome, its politics, architecture, and empire, we must also see this: the silent, unseen suffering of mothers and their infants. The lives cut short in dark chambers and crowded streets. The love and loss intertwined with every birth. Because no empire is greater than the lives it protects, especially those of its youngest and most vulnerable. twins were considered a bad omen. In the ancient world of Rome and its surrounding regions, the birth of twins was far from a cause for celebration. Unlike today, where twins might be seen as a miraculous blessing or a joyous rarity, many Roman communities regarded the arrival of twins with suspicion, dread, and superstition. Twins were often considered a bad omen, an unnatural doubling that disrupted the delicate balance of fate and destiny. This belief, deeply rooted in both myth and cultural fear, led to tragic consequences ranging from neglect to outright abandonment, or worse, particularly when one twin was weak, sickly, or born with deformities. The origins of this superstition trace back to a mixture of religious beliefs, folklore, and social anxieties. Romans believed the gods controlled the fates of individuals, and anything that deviated from the norm was suspect. A single child was expected. Two born simultaneously were viewed as a sign of divine displeasure or cosmic imbalance. In some regions, twins were thought to carry a dual nature, each sibling representing conflicting forces such as life and death, good and evil, or fortune and misfortune. This dichotomy created fear that one twin might drag the other toward ruin. One of the most pervasive beliefs was that twins were connected to ill fortune or calamity for their family or community. Stories circulated that twins would bring plague, famine, or war. The birth of twins could prompt immediate consultation with soothsayers or priests, who might declare the siblings cursed and advise drastic measures. The well-being of the larger community often outweighed individual compassion, and families found themselves pressured by neighbors or religious authorities to act against the twins. The treatment of twins, therefore, was harsh and often heartbreaking. If both appeared healthy and strong, they might be reluctantly accepted, but suspicion never fully lifted. More commonly, if one twin was sickly, malformed, or showed signs of weakness, the child might be abandoned shortly after birth. Historical texts and archaeological evidence reveal instances where twins were left to die outside city walls, placed in jars or pits, or exposed to the elements, a practice aligned with the wider Roman customs of infanticide and exposure for unwanted or disabled infants. This neglect was not limited to physical abandonment. Twins were often excluded from inheritance and social recognition. The notion that they were cursed could lead to lifelong stigma. Families might hide twins away, prevent them from participating in religious rites, or deny them education and social opportunities. The psychological impact of such ostracism would have been profound, shaping the lives of these children from birth. Yet, the story of twins in Rome is not entirely one of doom. There are notable exceptions and paradoxes. For example, the legendary founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, were twins, abandoned but saved, destined for greatness. Their story was a cultural cornerstone that complicated popular superstition, suggesting that twins could also symbolize power, renewal, and divine favor. However, such myths did little to alleviate the everyday fears of ordinary Romans facing the birth of twins. The superstition surrounding twins also reflected broader anxieties about control, purity, and the unknown. In a society where order and hierarchy were paramount, the unexpected doubling of life represented chaos. Twins blurred the lines between individuality and sameness, fate and chance. In this light, the harsh treatment of twins was a grim attempt to restore order, to protect the community from the unknown. Today, as we look back on these ancient beliefs, we see the weight of fear and ignorance that shaped human lives. Twins, who might have been cherished as unique gifts, were too often condemned by superstition. Their stories remind us how culture and belief can profoundly influence human experience, sometimes with devastating consequences. So when you imagine ancient Rome and its people, remember the twins, those born together into suspicion, those caught between blessing and curse, whose fates were decided not just by the gods, but by the fears of the living. Your child could be taken by the church. In the labyrinth of ancient and medieval societies, where survival often balanced precariously on the edge of poverty, one of the most heartbreaking realities was the threat of losing your child, not to illness, war, or accident, but to the very institutions that promised salvation, the church and the noble estates. If a family was too poor to feed their child, or found themselves entangled in debt, local clergy or nobles had the power to claim that child, placing them into monastic life or servitude, often without the parents' consent or any hope of reunion. This practice was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of hardship, but a systematic mechanism rooted in social, economic, and religious structures. The church, a dominant force in daily life, wielded tremendous authority over communities. Monasteries and convents were not only spiritual centers, but also social institutions that absorbed those considered burdens or potential threats to social order. When a family fell on hard times, it was not uncommon for clergy to intervene, ostensibly for the child's own good, but also to serve the church's interests. Children raised within monastic walls became novices, servants, or, in some cases, future clergy themselves, integral to the church's power and economic network. For indebted families, surrendering a child was sometimes a desperate act, a forced transaction. Owing money to a noble or to the church itself could mean forfeiting one's offspring as collateral. The child might be taken away as a form of repayment, bound to labor or religious life until the debt was considered settled. In many cases, parents had no legal recourse. The powerful few dictated the terms, and poverty stripped families of any bargaining power. The conditions within monastic institutions varied widely. Some children received education, religious instruction, and basic care. But many lived lives marked by strict discipline, isolation, and loss of freedom. Removed from their families and communities, these children grew up in cloisters that prized obedience and submission above all else. Their personal identities were subsumed into the collective identity of the monastery or convent, often severing all ties to their birth families forever. The psychological trauma of such forced separation was profound. Parents lived with the pain of absence, unsure if they would ever see their child again. Children, taken from familiar surroundings, faced bewilderment, loneliness, and a future dictated by others' decisions. This was a silent tragedy repeated across generations, invisible in official records, but etched deeply into personal histories. This practice also served political and social functions. Nobles used the placement of children in religious houses to secure alliances, control local populations, or remove rivals' heirs from succession. The church expanded its influence by increasing its numbers, strengthening its labor force, and cultivating loyalty from a young age. Thus, the taking of children was both a tool of control and a means of survival for the powerful, at the expense of the vulnerable. Families sometimes resisted, hiding children or fleeing to avoid clerical intervention. Others turned to folk remedies, bribes, or appeals to sympathetic priests. But resistance was dangerous. Accusations of heresy, rebellion, or neglect could be levied against parents who defied church authority. The risk of punishment kept many silent, forced into submission by fear. In the shadow of these grim realities, faith itself became a complex refuge and burden. For some, sending a child to a monastery was an act of hope, that their child might find security, education, and salvation unavailable at home. For others, it was a bitter sacrifice, an enforced loss wrapped in religious rhetoric. The legacy of this practice echoes through history, reminding us of the fragile line between protection and oppression, charity and control. It reveals how institutions wielding spiritual authority could profoundly shape lives, sometimes with compassion, often with coercion. And it underscores the harsh truth that in societies marked by inequality, children, symbols of hope and continuity, could become pawns in struggles far beyond their understanding or consent. Cold winters killed infants in their sleep. Winter in ancient Rome was a brutal trial, not just for the city's bustling streets or its soldiers, but for its most vulnerable, the infants. While Rome's grandeur often dazzles us, its marble temples, grand forums, and engineering marvels, the daily lives of ordinary families reveal a harsher truth. No insulation, no central heating, only crude hearths that barely warmed a single room. For babies, this was a matter of life and death. Unlike today's climate-controlled homes, Roman dwellings were drafty and cold, especially during the bitterest months. Walls made of stone and wood offered scant protection against piercing winds. Floors were cold and often dirt or stone. Fires were kept minimal to conserve precious wood and avoid smoke that could choke the cramped living quarters. In this unforgiving environment, the tiniest bodies, infants not yet able to regulate their own temperatures, were exposed to deadly cold. Archaeological evidence, combined with historical texts, shows that infant mortality spiked during winter. Cold stress lowered babies' immune defenses, making them susceptible to respiratory infections, hypothermia, and sudden infant death. But the most heartbreaking cause was simple freezing. Infants, swaddled in thin cloth or left sleeping in cool rooms, often succumbed quietly in their cribs, their tiny bodies chilled to the bone. The ancient Romans did what they could. Families wrapped infants in layers of fabric, used straw-filled mattresses, and positioned beds close to hearths. But the risk was relentless. In the poorer districts, where heating was minimal or absent, the threat grew even graver. Wet nurses, if present, would share body heat, but not all infants had this advantage. The rich might afford better care, but even wealth could not fully shield newborns from winter's cruelty. When a child died in these cold months, the ritual of burial itself was harsh and sobering. The ground often froze solid, making graves difficult to dig. Families sometimes labored by torchlight into the night, breaking frozen earth with rudimentary tools. Archaeologists have uncovered burial sites where infant graves lie deep beneath packed soil and frost-cracked layers, silent testaments to the hardships endured. Romans believed in the gods' protection, but also feared winter's wrath. Festivals like the Saturnalia, held in December, were as much pleas for warmth and survival as celebrations. The fragility of life during these months was woven into myth and ritual, a constant reminder that even in the heart of civilization, nature ruled supreme. This seasonal peril left its mark on Roman culture and family life. Some historians suggest that harsh winters influenced naming patterns, with certain months associated with higher infant death rates. Literary sources recount mournful laments and prayers specifically for children lost to cold. The imagery of a child's breath turning to frost became a poignant symbol of innocence cut short. Moreover, the impact extended beyond grief. The loss of infants affected population growth, labor availability, and family structures. Mothers grieved repeatedly, and communities learned resilience in the face of recurring winter tragedy. In some cases, they resorted to early swaddling techniques and the use of rudimentary incubators, heated clay vessels designed to protect infants, though these were limited and not widespread. In the end, cold winter nights in ancient Rome were silent killers. They claimed the youngest lives without fanfare. Their absence felt deeply yet often unrecorded. While the empire thrived in conquest and culture, within its homes, families faced the merciless cold alone, burying their hopes beneath frost and firelight. This stark reality reminds us that beneath the towering achievements of ancient Rome lay human stories of struggle and loss, reminding us how precious warmth, care, and life truly are. Plague wiped out entire households overnight. There are moments in history when the world seems to stop breathing, when life and death crowd so close that the difference between them becomes a matter of hours, not years. In the darkest centuries of Europe, the arrival of plague was one of those moments. The Black Death swept through cities and villages like a shadow with claws, a sickness so swift and merciless that it could erase an entire household in the space of a single night. It began quietly, maybe a fever, a cough, a child who seemed tired and wouldn't eat. Then came the swellings, painful black lumps in the armpits and groin. Within hours, the victim would be shivering with chills, burning with fever, delirious, begging for water, or falling into a sleep they would never wake from. The plague did not discriminate. It did not wait for the old or spare the young. Children and infants died alongside their parents, whole families vanishing as if they had never been. In some towns, neighbors watched in horror as a single cough in the morning became a house shrouded in silence by sundown. The door would be marked, sometimes with a painted cross or a bundle of straw, a signal to keep away. Those who dared enter would find only the dead, or the dying, clutching each other in terror, too weak to call for help. Babies orphaned in cradles, mothers lying cold on dirt floors, fathers gone before the sun had set. The sounds of grief were drowned by the sound of wheels, carts carrying bodies to hurried mass graves. There was no logic to the plague's cruelty. Wealth offered little protection. Nobles and beggars perished side by side. Priests who came to pray fell ill themselves, leaving prayers unfinished and families unblessed. Doctors, powerless and terrified, tried every remedy they knew: bleeding, burning herbs, aromatic charms, even the wildest superstitions. But nothing slowed the sickness. It leapt from house to house, street to street, city to city. One breath was all it took. People lived in fear of their own homes. To fall sick was to be shunned, locked inside, left to die with your family as the outside world sealed you off. Doors were nailed shut, markets emptied, fields were left untended, livestock wandered through abandoned villages. Even the bells that tolled for the dead rang so often that they seemed to toll for the living as well. The fabric of society began to unravel. Children, if they survived, sometimes wandered the streets alone, orphans in a world of ghosts. Entire households stood empty, possessions left untouched, food still on the tables, beds still warm. For every story of a single survivor, there were 100 of loss. Grandparents gone, mothers gone, fathers gone, and with them, every memory, every hope, every song and story that made that household unique. The plague erased not just bodies, but identities. Historians found entire villages abandoned, fields overgrown, homes swallowed by time. The Black Death was not a single event, but a rolling wave, returning every few decades, wiping out new generations, teaching each in turn how quickly life could vanish. Some found a kind of grim courage in the face of so much death. Neighbors risked their lives to bring food to the sick, to care for orphaned children, to bury the bodies that no one else would touch. Others surrendered to despair or turned on one another, blaming strangers, outcasts, or even the sky itself for the disaster. Fear bred suspicion, suspicion bred violence, and families that survived the plague sometimes found themselves shattered in other ways. When the worst had passed, survivors returned to a world changed forever. New families formed in the ruins of the old. Orphaned children were taken in or wandered to other towns in search of safety and kindness. The echoes of loss lingered in every street, every empty house, every faded grave. The Black Death left scars. Not just on bodies, but on hearts and histories. Its lessons were brutal and unforgettable, that love is fragile, that safety is fleeting, and that life can be lost in a single breath. But somehow, through all that darkness, people endured. New stories began. The world, wounded, kept turning. Yet for those who lived through the nightmare, the memory never faded. A reminder of how easily everything can be lost, and how precious every heartbeat, every family, every dawn truly is. Naming a child. After a dead sibling was normal. In ancient times, death was woven into the fabric of daily life, more intimately than we can imagine today. Families lived under the shadow of loss, especially when it came to children. The world was harsh, medicine was rudimentary, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. It was an age when the death of a child was not an exception, but often a grim expectation. In this unforgiving context, something might seem strange, even unsettling to modern ears. Parents commonly named a new child after a sibling who had died. It was not an act of forgetting, nor of indifference. Rather, it was a complex tradition born of remembrance, hope, and the brutal realities of survival. To reuse a name was both a way to honor a lost life and to cling to continuity amidst chaos. When a beloved infant passed, their name carried a weight, a presence in memory that families wished to preserve. But in a society where lineage and family identity were paramount, the name was also a symbol of survival and social standing. The same name could live on, given to a younger sibling who, it was hoped, would grow strong where another had not. Roman families practiced this widely. Archaeological records show tombstones and inscriptions where names recur within the same family, sometimes with the notation Secundus or Tertius appended, marking the second or third bearer of the name. Sometimes, even the same exact name was given, with no modifier, as if the name itself could reclaim the lost soul or fulfill the destiny denied before. This practice was deeply practical as well. In a world without birth certificates or formal identity documents, names carried legal and social power. Naming a child after a deceased sibling helped maintain family property rights, inheritance claims, and social recognition. It was a way to ensure the continuity of a family's place within the larger Roman society. But this tradition carried emotional complexities. Parents balanced grief and hope, mourning and renewal. Naming a new baby after a dead child was a ritual of remembrance, a way to keep the lost one close even as they moved forward. Yet it also carried an unspoken tension, the hope that the new bearer would not meet the same fate. Across cultures and time, this phenomenon echoes. It reminds us that names are not just labels, but vessels of memory, identity, and love. In the brutal landscape of ancient Rome, where loss was a constant companion, this practice offered a fragile thread of connection. Some historians speculate that this naming custom may have helped families cope with repeated grief, turning tragedy into a form of legacy. Others see it as a way to defy death itself. By passing a name through generations, families symbolically resisted oblivion. Yet, it was not always seamless. Confusion could arise in social circles and legal matters. Stories passed down warn of the emotional toll, as surviving siblings bore the weight of names carried by those who never lived beyond infancy. The names held ghosts. Still, the tradition endured, woven into funerary inscriptions, household records, and literary texts. it was a mirror of a society grappling with mortality on a scale modern people find hard to fathom. Today, when we hear of a family naming a child after a deceased relative, it can evoke sadness, reverence, or hope. But in ancient Rome, it was a necessity, a tribute, and a promise. A way to remember those lost and to nurture those who remained. Through this simple act, families claimed continuity in the face of relentless death. They told the world, "We endure. We remember. We live. Poor women gave birth while still working in fields." In the vast, dusty fields of ancient Rome's countryside, far from the marble palaces and bustling city streets, life was a relentless struggle, especially for peasant women. These women, the backbone of rural life, bore a burden few could imagine. Childbirth, a perilous and exhausting ordeal, did not grant them rest or respite. Instead, many gave birth amidst the very labor they depended on for survival, beside haystacks, among the crops, or even during the endless chores that defined their daily existence. For these women, the cycle of life and toil was unbroken, brutal, and unyielding. The agrarian lifestyle demanded constant work. From dawn until dusk, women toiled alongside men, planting, harvesting, tending animals, and preparing food. There was no room for maternity leave, no safe haven for rest. When labor pains began, many had no choice but to find a secluded spot in the fields, beneath the scorching sun or the chill of early morning, to deliver their children. Without midwives or medical care close at hand, birth was a solitary and dangerous event. Women relied on instinct, passed down wisdom, and the presence of fellow laborers to help when possible. Archaeological findings and historical accounts reveal a harsh truth. These births were often unattended, hurried, and fraught with risk. The physical demands of pregnancy were compounded by malnutrition and exposure to the elements. Women labored through swollen limbs and fatigue, often until the very moment their bodies gave out. The notion of a clean, protected birthing space was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For peasant women, birth happened wherever life and labor intersected. Tragically, the dangers did not end with delivery. Many women returned to work the very same day, bloodied, weak, and vulnerable. Bleeding after childbirth, lochia, could last for weeks, yet stopping work was rarely an option. The survival of the family depended on every hand. To cease labor was to risk starvation. The fields would not wait, nor would the landlord's demands. This brutal necessity forced women to push their bodies beyond human limits, risking infection, exhaustion, and death. Contemporary Roman writers often ignored or dismissed the plight of peasant women, focusing instead on elite childbirth rituals. But glimpses of rural suffering appear in legal texts and folk tales, where the resilience and the tragedy of these women is undeniable. The emotional toll was immense. Mothers mourned the children they lost to childbirth complications or early illness, while simultaneously forced to prepare for the next season's work and the next pregnancy. The cyclical nature of poverty and labor meant that many women never fully recovered between births. The average life expectancy for rural women was drastically shortened by repeated pregnancies, hard labor, and lack of medical care. Midwives, when available, were often traveling healers with limited resources. They could offer prayers, herbal remedies, or crude assistance, but modern interventions were centuries away. Despite this, peasant women's contribution was vital. Their endurance under these conditions kept the wheels of Rome's agricultural economy turning. Without their strength, the city's granaries would have emptied, and the empire's armies starved. Their stories, mostly untold in official histories, are etched into the soil they worked and the generations they bore. So when you envision the grandeur of Rome, remember the women hidden in the field's shadows, birthing life while gathering grain, bleeding and exhausted, yet rising again to face the sun. Their survival was not guaranteed. Their courage was unrecorded, but their labor was the true foundation of an empire. Illness was blamed on the mother's sins. In the shadowed corners of ancient and medieval societies, where understanding of medicine was limited and superstition reigned supreme, the birth of a sick child or the early death of an infant was not merely a biological tragedy, it became a moral judgment. Mothers bore the brunt of this harsh blame. If a baby was born ill, malformed, or failed to survive its first days, society often accused the mother of sin, impiety, or even witchcraft. This cruel association added layers of shame and isolation to grief, turning private sorrow into public condemnation. The origins of this belief were deeply rooted in religious and cultural frameworks that linked purity and morality to health and fortune. In many communities, childbirth was seen not only as a physical event, but as a spiritual trial. A healthy child was a blessing, a sign of divine favor. Conversely, illness or death was interpreted as punishment, a tangible sign of a mother's spiritual failings or moral corruption. This perspective was amplified by the limited medical knowledge of the time. Without understanding infection, genetics, or neonatal health, people sought explanations that fit their worldview. Mothers who experienced complications during pregnancy, difficult labor, or infant loss found themselves under scrutiny. Accusations might arise that they had angered the gods, broken sacred taboos, or engaged in forbidden practices. In more fearful times, whispers of witchcraft spread rapidly. Mothers could be suspected of casting curses, consorting with evil spirits, or deliberately harming their children. Such suspicions often led to social ostracism, legal punishment, or violent persecution. Religious authorities played a complex role in this dynamic. While clergy offered prayers and rituals to protect mothers and infants, they also reinforced ideas that linked sin and sickness. Confessions, penance, and spiritual examinations became part of the maternal experience, intertwining faith with fear. Women were encouraged to demonstrate their innocence through ritual purity, fasting, or pilgrimages, adding physical and emotional strain during an already vulnerable time. This blame extended beyond individuals to affect family honor and social standing. A mother's reputation could be irreparably damaged by a child's illness or death. Marriages could be strained or dissolved. Families might be shunned, excluded from community events, or lose economic opportunities. The pressure to bear healthy offspring, particularly sons, was immense, and failure carried steep social costs. The psychological toll was devastating. Mothers lived in fear not only for their children's survival, but also for their own safety and dignity. Grief became compounded by guilt and shame, isolating women when they needed support most. The absence of medical solutions meant that no amount of prayer or ritual could guarantee a different outcome. Yet mothers bore the burden of blame regardless. Despite this, women found ways to resist and cope. Folk healers, midwives, and wise women offered remedies, charms, and knowledge passed down through generations. Some mothers sought solace in community networks or secret rituals that defied official doctrine. Over time, gradual shifts in medical understanding and religious thought began to challenge these harmful beliefs, though remnants persisted for centuries. This harsh reality reminds us how intertwined health, morality, and social judgment have been throughout history. The story of mothers blamed for their children's illness reveals the profound vulnerabilities faced by women and the heavy cost of ignorance and fear. It underscores the necessity of compassion, knowledge, and support in confronting tragedy, a lesson as vital today as it was in the past, children were married before puberty in some regions. In the shadows of ancient Rome's grandeur and law lay customs that today shock the conscience. Among these was the practice of marrying children, sometimes before they had even learned to speak full sentences. This wasn't isolated to one province or a moment in time. It was a calculated, harsh reality in many regions of the empire, driven by power, property, and survival. Marriage in ancient Rome was never purely a matter of affection or personal choice. It was a tool, an instrument wielded by families to secure alliances, protect estates, and ensure political or economic continuity. While most citizens married in their late teens or early adulthood, there existed practices, especially in rural or provincial areas, where children were betrothed and even formally married long before puberty. These unions served several purposes. Foremost was the consolidation of wealth and land. A marriage contract between families tied estates and fortunes together, reducing the risk of property loss and creating networks of loyalty. For noble or wealthy landowners, marrying off a child early could secure peace between rival clans or extend influence into newly conquered territories. The children themselves, often no more than toddlers, were pawns in this game. Their personal development, desires, or consent were irrelevant. The ceremony might involve symbolic gestures, exchanges of rings or tokens, formal pronouncements by family heads, and legal contracts inscribed on wax tablets or stone. These early marriages were binding in the eyes of law and custom, setting the stage for future cohabitation when the children came of age. Roman law recognized the concept of usus, the practice by which cohabitation over a year could establish a marriage. But even before this, betrothal and early marriage arrangements held social and legal weight. Families expected children to fulfill these agreements as they grew, sometimes pressuring them into unions years before their bodies or minds were ready. This practice was not without consequences. Child brides and grooms faced enormous pressures. Girls married before puberty were often separated from their families and placed into unfamiliar households, expected to adapt to adult roles long before they understood them. The physical toll was severe. Early pregnancy posed significant health risks, often leading to complications or death. Emotional trauma, isolation, and the loss of childhood innocence were unspoken wounds carried silently. Despite these harsh realities, early marriage was woven into the fabric of Roman society. It was justified as a safeguard of family honor, lineage, and social order. Fathers and mothers saw themselves as protectors of legacy, willing to sacrifice their children's youth to the demands of empire and estate. Public opinion, too, reinforced these norms. A family that failed to secure advantageous marriages for its offspring risked social decline or suspicion. In some provinces, local customs intensified this practice. For example, in rural Gaul or Hispania, early betrothals mirrored tribal traditions, blending Roman legal structures with indigenous rites. This fusion created rigid expectations, where a child's future was fixed almost from birth, with marriage as a predetermined destiny rather than a choice. Ancient texts reflect the tension this caused. Writers like Juvenal and Martial lamented the loss of innocence, satirizing families that treated children as commodities. Philosophers questioned the morality, but rarely did they alter customs. For most Romans, the empire's needs, political stability, economic security, outweighed individual welfare. Archaeological findings support this grim picture. Tomb inscriptions sometimes list ages of brides or grooms as young as 12 or 13, indicating early marriages were not rare exceptions, but recognized realities. Household artifacts suggest that children assumed adult roles and responsibilities unusually early, reinforcing social expectations. As society evolved, these practices slowly declined, especially with the spread of Christianity, which promoted marriage based more on mutual consent and later age. Yet the legacy of child marriage in ancient Rome remains a stark reminder of how power and tradition can override childhood, turning families into battlegrounds of control. Understanding this aspect of Roman life offers a deeper, more nuanced view of the empire, not just as a pinnacle of civilization, but as a place where childhood was often sacrificed on the altar of politics and property. Having too many daughters was a financial crisis. In a world where survival was measured in coins and reputation, even love for your children could become a burden. To have a daughter was a blessing, until it became too many. Because in the eyes of medieval and early modern society, every girl was a looming financial storm. Families didn't just worry about food or clothing, they feared the dowry, the price of a daughter's future. The dowry was more than tradition. It was the price of admission to marriage, a tangible sum a family paid to secure a daughter's place in another household. In some lands, it was gold or silver. In others, it might be livestock, land, jewels, or anything of value. The richer the groom's family, the higher the dowry demanded. And for poor families, the calculation was cruel. One daughter meant scraping together every coin. 2 daughters meant sacrifices. 3 or more. And the sums became impossible. It was a crisis that crept into every conversation, every sleepless night. Fathers counted their savings again and again. Mothers wept over empty purses, and daughters grew up under the shadow of their own futures. The love parents felt clashed with the fear that they might not afford a decent match. Some families took on crushing debts, borrowing from relatives or moneylenders, gambling on a good marriage that could lift them all out of poverty. But more often, the dowry simply deepened the hole. For many, hope curdled into desperation. Parents pleaded with distant kin, begged in the streets, or sent daughters to the doors of convents. Becoming a nun wasn't always a calling. It was often a last resort, a way to escape the dowry trap. The church, at times, demanded smaller, spiritual dowries, but for many, even this was a challenge. Other girls remained unmarried, living on the edges of society, branded as burdens, spinsters, or, worse, temptations to scandal. In some cities, laws were even passed to regulate dowries, to cap the spiraling sums, but the pressure remained. For daughters, life became a test of patience and hope. Some were lucky, betrothed young to boys from good families. Others watched as younger sisters were matched first, because their parents could only afford one dowry at a time. Rivalries brewed. Shame simmered. The simple act of being born a girl could transform the warmth of home into a landscape of anxiety. In some tragic cases, unwanted newborn girls were abandoned at church steps or left in the care of strangers, a desperate act by parents who simply couldn't face the financial ruin another dowry would bring. The stories haunt the records. Tiny bundles left in the night, mothers hiding their tears, priests carrying babies to overcrowded orphanages. Those who survived grew up with the knowledge that their very existence was once considered too expensive. But the dowry wasn't just a burden. It was a double-edged sword. For a fortunate few, it was a ticket to freedom. A generous dowry could open doors, secure a powerful alliance, or rescue a girl from the dangers of poverty. Some families, desperate for an advantage, risked everything for a single, spectacular match, selling land, pawning heirlooms, investing in one daughter's future with the hope that she might help the others later. But this gamble left many in ruin. As society changed, the grip of the dowry system weakened, but the scars remained. The expectation that a daughter's worth could be measured in money or property echoes through generations. Even now, in places where dowries are outlawed or discouraged, whispers of the old crisis persist. In anxiety over weddings, inheritances, or the silent pressure to prove a daughter's value. The crisis of too many daughters was not born of malice, but of a world that measured love in coins and futures in contracts. Yet behind every dowry, every debt, every sleepless night, there was always something stronger. A parent's hope for their child's happiness, and a daughter's quiet dream of being wanted for who she was, not what she cost. Babies were left at monastery doors. When families starved, in the harsh shadows of history, when famine descended upon the land like a merciless specter, families faced unimaginable despair. Crops failed, rivers ran dry, and the once bustling marketplaces fell silent, emptied of food and hope. In these desperate times, survival became a brutal struggle, and the innocent, babies, became silent victims of a world turned unforgiving. The heartbreaking reality was that many parents, driven by starvation and hopelessness, left their newborn children at the cold, unyielding doors of monasteries and churches, places thought to offer sanctuary and mercy. These small hands, so full of promise yet so fragile, were abandoned with a prayer, a silent plea for survival that so often went unanswered. Famine was not merely a scarcity of food, it was a breakdown of society's very fabric. Throughout history, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe, when crops failed due to drought, war, or plague, the ripple effects spread wide and deep. Families that once thrived found themselves stripped bare, forced into impossible decisions. The eldest might be spared, but infants, unable to fend for themselves, were a burden too heavy to bear when food was scarce and hope was fading. Monasteries and churches stood as beacons in this darkness, institutions bound by faith and charity. Their doors symbolized refuge, places where the desperate might find aid and the destitute a chance at life. Yet these sanctuaries were often overwhelmed. Records and chronicles from medieval Europe reveal accounts of infants left at monastery gates, wrapped in rags or simple swaddling, sometimes with notes naming the child or offering pleas for care. These anonymous babies, sometimes called foundlings, were taken in when possible, but many perished within hours or days due to exposure, malnutrition, or illness. The act of leaving a child at a monastery was both an act of desperation and hope. Desperation born of starvation, and hope that the sanctity of the church would protect what their own hands could not. But the reality was grim. Monasteries lacked the resources to care for so many, and without modern medicine or infant care knowledge, survival rates were low. The cold stone floors, the inadequate warmth, the scarce food, all conspired against these fragile lives. This tragic practice reveals much about the societal structures of the time. The church's role extended beyond spiritual guidance. It was a crucial part of social welfare. Monastic orders often ran hospitals, orphanages, and almonries, serving the poor and abandoned. Yet their ability to sustain this charity was limited, particularly during periods of widespread famine. Chroniclers describe scenes of overcrowded infirmaries and exhausted monks struggling to provide even the most basic care. Moreover, this practice speaks to the brutal realities of family survival in historical periods marked by instability. Children were not only heirs or blessings, but also economic dependents. When food was insufficient for the entire family, and there was no social safety net, parents faced the harrowing choice of sacrificing their youngest to preserve themselves and other children. The emotional anguish of such decisions is unfathomable, a silent testament to human endurance amid catastrophe. The legacy of these abandoned infants echoes through history, influencing the establishment of foundling hospitals and more organized social care systems in later centuries. These institutions aimed to reduce infant mortality and provide alternatives to abandonment. Yet, the deep scars left by famine and abandonment remind us of the fragility of life and the limits of compassion when stretched too thin. As we reflect on these histories, the image of a tiny, trembling infant left at a monastery door resonates as a profound symbol of despair and hope intertwined. It forces us to confront the harshness of the past and the enduring human capacity for both suffering and mercy. In remembering these forgotten lives, we honor not just the children lost, but also the resilience of the families and communities that navigated the darkest hours of human history. Their stories compel us to value and protect the vulnerable, ensuring that the tragedies of hunger and abandonment remain relics of a less compassionate time. You had to defend your children from wolves. In the dense forests bordering the rural villages of ancient Rome and beyond, a constant lurking danger shadowed everyday life: wolves. Far from the safety of city walls and imperial legions, these wild predators were a very real threat, not just to livestock, but to the most vulnerable: children. For families living on the edges of civilization, the threat of wolves shaped daily routines, fears, and desperate acts of protection. It was not merely a story of myth or legend. It was a brutal reality that haunted the waking hours and shattered the peace of night. Imagine a small child, no older than 5 or 6, tasked with gathering firewood or fetching water from a nearby stream. These were simple, necessary chores, but they carried grave risks. Forest paths twisted through shadow and silence, punctuated by the distant howls of wolves echoing through the trees. Mothers and fathers could only watch with helpless dread as their children disappeared into the woods, hoping for a quick return, but fearing the worst. Many never came back. Wolves were not just scavengers, they were skilled hunters. Packs operated with terrifying coordination, stalking villages at night, preying on unattended animals, and sometimes on children left alone for too long. Stories passed down through generations told of children snatched from doorsteps, dragged into the forest, and never seen again. The grief of families was compounded by the knowledge that no rescue could reach into the dense wilds fast enough. Villagers adapted with grim resolve. Children rarely ventured far from the community. Older siblings accompanied younger ones. Fires blazed near homes, not only for warmth, but as beacons of safety. Dogs, valued protectors, were trained to alert to approaching danger and to confront wolves. Yet these measures were never foolproof. Wolves were cunning, and hunger made them bold. Historical texts, while sparse on everyday rural life, hint at the terror wolves inspired. Roman poets and playwrights used wolf imagery as symbols of death and danger, reflecting a shared cultural fear. In some local laws, punishments for those who neglected to guard children properly could be severe, underscoring the communal responsibility to protect the young. The boundary between wilderness and village was a thin, fragile line, maintained by vigilance and courage. The psychological impact on children was profound. Raised in a world where even play carried risk, they learned early to respect the forest's silence and the danger it concealed. Folktales often warned of the wolf's cunning, teaching children to stay close, to avoid dark woods, and to trust in the village's protection. Yet the line between caution and terror was always blurred. For parents, the constant threat was a source of heartbreak and fury. Each disappearance was a wound to the community, a reminder of human fragility against nature's wild forces. Yet survival demanded stoicism. Life went on. Fields had to be tended, fires maintained, and children raised. The wolf was a predator, but the village was resilience incarnate. So when you imagine the peaceful countryside of ancient times, hear not only the bird song, but the distant, mournful howl. Remember the children sent for firewood, the eyes of mothers scanning the forest edge, and the harsh reality that in those days, To protect a child meant standing guard against shadows that moved with teeth and hunger. Wolves were more than beasts. They were a force that shaped life itself, a reminder that survival was a daily battle on the razor's edge between the wild and the home. Injuries meant permanent disability or death. In the ancient and medieval world, the fragility of the human body was brutally exposed every time a person suffered an injury. What today might be treated quickly and effectively often meant a slow descent into disability or death. Without modern medicine, antibiotics, or anesthetics, even a simple cut could turn fatal, and accidents involving falls, burns, or broken bones frequently resulted in permanent disability or gruesome amputation. Life was a constant gamble against the vulnerability of flesh and the unknown horrors of infection. Imagine a farmer working in the fields, a craftsman at his bench, or a soldier marching with heavy armor. A careless slip, a sharp tool, or a fall could cause wounds that today would be minor, but then were life-threatening. A cut might seem small, but could easily become infected. Without understanding germs, infections spread unchecked. Pus, fever, swelling, signs of the body's battle, often marked the beginning of a fatal decline. The medical knowledge to clean wounds or administer effective treatments simply did not exist. When infection took hold, options were limited and brutal. Amputation was often the last resort, a desperate attempt to stop the spread of gangrene. But without anesthetic, the procedure was unimaginably painful. Surgeons used knives or saws, working quickly but without precision, risking further injury or shock. Many patients died on the table or soon after from blood loss or infection introduced during surgery. Broken bones presented another perilous challenge. Without modern setting techniques or internal fixation, fractures might heal incorrectly or never fully heal at all. A broken leg could mean permanent lameness. A crushed limb could become necrotic and require amputation. Mobility was not just about comfort, it was about survival. A disabled person risked poverty, neglect, and social isolation. Burns, too, were deadly. Exposure to fire or boiling liquids caused damage that modern medicine now treats with specialized care. But back then, burns often led to open wounds vulnerable to infection. The pain was excruciating, and the risk of shock and systemic infection high. Scarring could be disfiguring and limit function, further diminishing a person's quality of life. The psychological toll of such injuries was immense. People lived in constant fear, not just of the injury itself, but of the aftermath. The loss of a limb or chronic pain meant dependence on others in a society that valued physical strength and productivity. Without social safety nets, injury could plunge individuals and families into destitution. Despite these dangers, communities developed some practical knowledge. Herbal remedies, poultices, and cauterization were common treatments. Midwives, healers, and local physicians used whatever means they had to alleviate pain and promote healing. Some surgeries were surprisingly sophisticated for their time, relying on trial, error, and tradition. Yet, the limitations were stark. The legacy of these harsh realities is a testament to human resilience amid adversity. Every healed wound, every surviving injury was a small victory against overwhelming odds. But the shadow of permanent disability or death hung over every accident, reminding all that life was fragile and precious. Understanding this vulnerability helps us appreciate the advancements of modern medicine and the centuries of struggle that preceded it. It also highlights the courage of those who faced pain without relief, injury without cure, and disability without support. Survivors of a world where the body's limits were unforgiving, and every wound told a story of endurance. Orphaned children were sent to work before age 7. In ancient Rome, childhood was a fragile state, especially for orphans. When both parents died, often due to disease, warfare, or poverty, the fate of these vulnerable children was harsh and unforgiving. Far from the protective embrace of family, many were thrust into brutal realities at an age when modern society would still shield them with care and education. By 6 or 7 years old, these orphan children were often sent to workhouses, farms, or households, forced to labor long hours with no rights, no schooling, and little protection. The Roman social fabric depended heavily on family units as the primary source of care and education. Parents provided not just food and shelter, but also moral instruction and preparation for civic life. Orphanhood severed this vital bond, leaving children adrift in a system that valued utility over compassion. The state had few mechanisms to support these lost youths. Instead, survival often meant entering the workforce immediately. Workhouses, institutions designed to house and employ the poor and unwanted, became grim refuges for many orphans. These places were far from safe havens. They were centers of relentless labor, discipline, and neglect. Children as young as 6 could find themselves in chains, hauling goods, tending to animals, or performing menial tasks in workshops. The line between servant, slave, and prisoner blurred in these grim settings. On rural farms, orphaned children were cheap labor, assigned to the hardest physical work under harsh supervision. Without education or guidance, their childhoods were lost to toil. Records from legal texts and municipal decrees show little concern for the welfare of these children. Instead, emphasis was placed on their productivity and the maintenance of order. Corporal punishment was common, and medical care scarce. Ancient writers like Juvenal and Seneca criticized the neglect and exploitation of the poor and orphaned, lamenting a society that allowed children to be commodified so cruelly. Yet their voices were rarely heeded in policy or practice. For many, an orphan's life was a cycle of hardship from which escape was nearly impossible. Education, when it occurred, was reserved for the privileged. Without family advocates or wealth, orphaned children rarely learned to read, write, or develop skills beyond basic labor. This lack of opportunity perpetuated poverty and marginalization across generations. Burial records and inscriptions sometimes reveal poignant details. Children who died young after years of forced labor, often unrecorded in official histories, but remembered in small, personal ways by communities. Their stories, largely lost to time, echo the systemic vulnerabilities of a civilization that prized power and order over individual welfare. This stark reality challenges the romanticized image of ancient Rome. Behind the triumphs of empire were countless children condemned to survive harshness with little hope, embodying the empire's blind spots and social inequalities. Reflecting on their plight helps us appreciate the progress made in child welfare and education, while acknowledging the enduring need to protect the most vulnerable in every society. Miscarriages were treated with fear and superstition. There are griefs that live in silence, hidden beneath layers of fear and misunderstanding. In the ancient world, and through the medieval centuries, miscarriage was one of these secret sorrows, a loss suffered in darkness, made heavier by the cruel weight of superstition. To lose a pregnancy was not just personal tragedy, it was a social crisis, a moment when fate, faith, and fear collided. Women who miscarried found themselves at the center of suspicion. In a world where every event was seen as the will of the gods or the result of invisible forces, the loss of a child, unseen, unborn, was rarely viewed as an accident. Instead, it became a question. What went wrong? Whose fault was it? What spirit, curse, or hidden sin had called misfortune down upon this house? For many, the answers were terrifying. Neighbors whispered, midwives grew cautious, elders consulted omens, and priests muttered prayers for protection. Women who miscarried might be accused of witchcraft, of making secret pacts with dark forces, of poisoning their own wombs, of carrying envy, anger, or lust that corrupted the fragile boundary between life and death. Some believed a woman's very shadow could bring harm to a fetus. Others insisted that evil spirits waited for moments of weakness, lurking near bedsides to snatch away life before it began. But it wasn't just about fear of the supernatural. Societies built their survival on the hope of children, especially sons. Every pregnancy was an investment in the future, a prayer for prosperity, security, and the continuity of the family line. When that hope was dashed, the shock could ripple outward, casting blame in every direction. Husbands grew distant, families anxious, communities judgmental. The woman at the center often found herself isolated, carrying not just grief, but the crushing shame of imagined guilt. Superstitions flourished. Amulets, potions, rituals, and taboos sprang up around pregnancy and birth. Women were forbidden from touching certain objects, eating certain foods, or speaking certain words. Some were locked away for the duration of pregnancy, surrounded by charms, and watched for signs of bad luck or ill will. If a miscarriage occurred, it was said that a curse had found its mark, or that the mother's soul was impure. In some cultures, cleansing ceremonies were demanded. In others, the woman was ostracized or sent to confess her sins before clergy or community elders. The punishment could be subtle or severe: coldness, gossip, exile, or in rare but devastating cases, even physical punishment. Some women were forced to undergo public rituals of penance or purification to prove their innocence. Others fled, hoping to escape the reputation of a bringer of misfortune. Families sometimes hid miscarriages, fearing the stain would spread, endangering sisters and daughters when it came time to marry. Despite all this, women quietly supported each other. In the shadowy corners where they gathered, there was whispered comfort, stories passed down, tears shed, hope offered. Midwives, themselves at risk, often shielded grieving mothers as best they could, blaming the stars or the gods or bad air to spare women the worst of the suspicion. But the pain lingered. The wound was not only physical, but spiritual and social. The language of loss was replaced by the language of blame. And the grief of miscarriage, which should have been met with compassion, too often met only with fear. Today, the world has changed, yet not enough. The shadows of superstition still linger in many places, and the silence around miscarriage still leaves too many women alone in their sorrow. But with every new story shared, with every act of understanding, the old chains loosen just a little. To remember this history is to honor those who suffered not only loss, but isolation. It is to see the courage in those who endured and the quiet resistance of those who loved in spite of fear. It is a reminder that compassion is the truest remedy for grief, and that every sorrow deserves understanding, not suspicion. Fathers often abandoned families after crop failure. In the brutal reality of famine-stricken times, when the earth refused to yield its bounty and the granaries lay empty, families faced devastation unlike any other. Crops failed, fields turned barren, and hunger gnawed relentlessly at the bellies of the young and old alike. In such desperate conditions, the very foundation of family life was tested, and often shattered. Without any welfare or social safety nets to catch the falling, many fathers found themselves pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Some abandoned their families, not out of cruelty, but from a complex mix of despair, fear, and a fractured sense of duty. The collapse of the harvest was more than an economic disaster. It was a rupture in the social fabric. Men, traditionally seen as providers and protectors, confronted a grim paradox. They could neither feed their loved ones nor themselves. The shame of helplessness weighed heavily. In some cases, the overwhelming despair of witnessing their families suffer starvation compelled men to leave, severing ties to escape the unbearable reality. Others left in search of distant work, driven by a flicker of hope that they might return with food, money, or aid. Yet many never returned. Historical records from agrarian societies across time, from the Roman Republic to medieval Europe, reveal patterns of this abandonment. Without structured welfare systems, the responsibility for survival rested solely on families. And if the head of the household vanished, the consequences were dire. Widowed mothers and elderly grandparents often became the sole caregivers, struggling against hunger and social marginalization. Abandoned children and spouses faced stigma, destitution, and a precarious existence. This abandonment was not a simple act of desertion. It was entangled with societal expectations, survival instincts, and psychological torment. Men carried the weight of failure, while families bore the burden of loss, not only of sustenance, but of leadership and protection. The absence of the father often accelerated the family's decline, deepening cycles of poverty and hunger. The lack of institutional support meant that these personal tragedies had public consequences. Entire communities could unravel as family units fractured. In some cases, this led to migration waves, increased crime, or reliance on charity from religious institutions and the wealthy. The church, often the only source of organized aid, struggled to fill the gaps left by absent fathers and failing lands. This historical reality sheds light on the complexities of human behavior under extreme stress. It challenges simplistic moral judgments and invites empathy for those caught in the unyielding grip of famine. The stories of fathers who left are as much about the desperation of survival as about abandonment. Understanding this aspect of famine's social impact deepens our appreciation for the resilience of those who remained, mothers, children, and elders, who bore the unimaginable burdens. It also underscores the critical importance of social welfare and community support systems that, today, strive to prevent such fragmentation. The echoes of these past struggles remind us that famine is not just a natural disaster, but a catalyst for profound social upheaval, testing the bonds that hold families and societies together. In those times of darkness, every choice bore consequences that rippled through generations, shaping the human story with sorrow, endurance, and sometimes heartbreaking separation. Marriage was mandatory to have a family at all. In ancient Rome, the institution of marriage was not merely a personal or social arrangement. It was a foundational pillar of society, law, and identity. To be a citizen with rights, status, and legacy, one had to be part of a legally recognized union. The concept of family was inseparable from marriage, and those who existed outside this framework, particularly unwed mothers and their children, faced severe consequences. The weight of law and custom pressed heavily on those who sought to create families without formal sanction, marking their lives with stigma, exclusion, and harsh punishment. Roman law was explicit and unyielding on this matter. Marriage, or matrimonium, was a sacred contract involving not just two individuals, but their families, property, and the state. It was a tool to regulate inheritance, ensure legitimate offspring, and preserve the social order. Children born within marriage, legitimi, were entitled to rights of citizenship, inheritance of land and property, and full participation in religious and social rights. Those born outside of wedlock, illegitimi or spurii, were legally marginalized. Their very existence was considered a threat to the purity of lineage and the continuity of family wealth. For unwed mothers, The risks were severe. Social ostracism was common, but so too were legal penalties. Depending on the time and region, unmarried pregnant women could face fines, loss of property rights, or be forcibly married to the child's father. In extreme cases, abandonment or exile were imposed to preserve family honor and public morality. The law was often harsher on women than men, reflecting the patriarchal nature of Roman society. Women bore the burden of chastity and fidelity, while men's transgressions were frequently overlooked or punished less severely. The children of unwed mothers faced a grim reality. Without the legal recognition granted by marriage, they were often denied inheritance rights. They could be excluded from wills, disinherited from family estates, and deprived of the social standing necessary to secure advantageous marriages themselves. In many cases, these children were considered outsiders, without a rightful place in the community or the family. Even in death, their exclusion persisted. Proper burial rites, crucial for ensuring peace in the afterlife according to Roman belief, were sometimes denied to children born outside marriage, condemning their spirits to unrest. This harsh system served multiple purposes. It reinforced social hierarchies, ensured clear lines of succession, and maintained property within legitimate family units. But it also enforced conformity through fear and punishment. The stigma surrounding unwed motherhood was not just about morality. It was about control. It compelled women to marry, legitimize children, and preserved the patriarchal order. In this way, marriage was mandatory, not only for social acceptance, but for survival and legacy. Yet, despite these constraints, unwed mothers existed, and children born outside marriage survived and sometimes thrived. Informal unions, concubinage, and clandestine relationships blurred the lines between legitimacy and illegitimacy. Some fathers acknowledged children born out of wedlock and provided for them privately. In certain provinces and periods, local customs softened the harshness of Roman law. Still, the ideal remained clear. Family meant marriage. The pressure to marry was relentless, shaping personal lives and political alliances alike. Young women were urged, sometimes forced, into unions that served family interests more than personal desire. Divorce was difficult and stigmatized, adding weight to the obligation. And for those who defied these norms, the cost was profound: exclusion, punishment, and a denial of the very rights that defined Roman citizenship. So when you consider the Roman family, imagine not just the happy unions and noble heirs, but the harsh legal and social realities that made marriage mandatory. Think of the women who risked everything, the children born in shadows, and the laws that enforced a rigid order where family could only exist within sanctioned bounds. Marriage was not just tradition. It was survival, status, and the foundation upon which Rome itself was built. Families shared beds with livestock in winter. In the biting cold of ancient and medieval winters, warmth was a precious commodity, one that many families could barely afford. Without modern heating or insulated homes, the harsh chill threatened life itself. To survive the freezing nights, entire families, parents, children, and even infants, often sought shelter not just inside their humble homes, but in barns alongside their livestock. This close, shared sleeping arrangement was a desperate adaptation to the cruel realities of poverty and climate, but it came with grave risks, particularly the frequent transmission of diseases between animals and humans. Imagine a typical rural household. The family's dwelling was a small, drafty space with a hearth that barely stoked enough heat to chase away the cold. Wood was scarce and expensive, and stoking fires constantly was dangerous and exhausting. Outside, bitter winds howled through cracks in the walls, seeping into every corner. Livestock, cows, Pigs, goats, and chickens were the family's livelihood, essential for food, labor, and income. But their shelters were often rudimentary, separate but close, and sometimes even part of the same structure as the human quarters. In winter, the lines blurred. To conserve warmth, families brought animals inside or slept in barns with them. The bodies of cattle, horses, and sheep radiated heat, providing a shared source of warmth against the frost. Infants would sleep near their mothers, who huddled close to the animals to preserve precious body heat. This arrangement was less about comfort and more about survival. The cold could kill just as surely as hunger. Yet this proximity had a hidden cost. Many diseases, bacterial, viral, and parasitic, jumped between species in these cramped quarters. Zoonotic infections, those transmissible from animals to humans, were common. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly through shared airspace, while parasites could move between skin and fur. Without knowledge of germs or hygiene, these infections went unchecked, contributing to high mortality rates, especially among children and the elderly. The cramped, damp conditions worsened health problems. Bedding was often straw or rough cloth, seldom cleaned regularly. Moisture from animal breath and waste created environments ripe for mold and bacteria. The close quarters meant that once one family member fell ill, sickness swept through the household like wildfire. Epidemics were frequent and devastating. Despite these dangers, families had few alternatives. Building separate, warm shelters for animals was beyond the means of most peasants and laborers. The risk of animal theft or predation was high if livestock was left outside unattended at night. The animals themselves were vital assets, sometimes worth more than the family's survival. Sharing space was a reluctant necessity born from desperation. This way of life shaped not only daily routines, but social structures and cultural beliefs. Care for animals was intertwined with care for family. Rituals and superstitions evolved around protecting both human and animal health. Seasonal festivals often involved prayers and offerings to ensure the well-being of livestock and people alike, acknowledging the fragile balance they shared. The shared beds and barns of winter illustrate the harshness of historical living conditions, where survival required compromises that modern eyes might find shocking. They remind us that warmth and shelter were battles fought nightly, with lives hanging in the balance. The intimate, sometimes dangerous closeness of families and animals was a testament to human resilience and adaptation in the face of relentless hardship. Understanding these realities helps us appreciate the comforts and knowledge we often take for granted today, highlighting the intertwined fates of humans and animals in history's coldest nights. You could be exiled for having too many mouths to feed. You could be exiled for having too many mouths to feed. In the harsh realities of ancient times, when famine, war, or economic collapse struck, survival often meant brutal choices. Choices that left entire families cast out, abandoned to wildernesses where death was a constant companion. This was not mere rumor or myth. Across Roman and neighboring rural communities, the expulsion of families deemed burdensome was a grim, documented practice, a desperate strategy for preserving the rest. When crops failed and granaries emptied, communities faced impossible strain. Food became scarce and tensions rose. The logic was cruel but clear. If there was not enough to feed everyone, some had to be sacrificed for the survival of others. Large families, especially those with many young children, were labeled as too many mouths to feed, a threat to the fragile balance. Elders, widows, and the poor with multiple dependents were often targeted first. Expulsion was a form of social death. Families were ordered to leave their homes, their fields, their livelihoods. Sometimes the decision came from local councils. Other times, it was enforced by powerful landlords or magistrates under duress. The victims were driven out beyond the borders of cultivated land, into forests dense with predators, into marshes where disease thrived, or across hostile terrain that offered no shelter. Ancient sources, including legal codes and historical chronicles, hint at such harsh measures. In the Roman countryside, laws sometimes explicitly addressed the treatment of poor or landless families during crises. Archaeological findings reveal abandoned villages and hastily dug graves in peripheral zones, consistent with sudden, forced migrations. Oral traditions preserved among rural peoples spoke of mass expulsions during times of scarcity, families left to perish or fend for themselves far from community support. Survival outside the village was precarious at best. The forests were full of wild beasts. The swamps bred fever and dysentery. Without tools, protection, or food stores, these exiled families faced starvation within weeks. Children were particularly vulnerable. Some might try to return secretly, only to be caught and punished. Others vanished into the wilderness, swallowed by nature's unforgiving embrace. This practice was an unspoken tool of social control. By threatening exile, authorities could enforce rationing, reduce population pressure, and quell unrest. But it was also a method of exclusion, removing those who were seen as weak or unproductive from the economic and social fabric. The message was brutal. Your worth was tied to your ability to contribute to survival. If you failed, you were expendable. Yet, despite this cruelty, the expelled families were not always voiceless. Some formed marginalized communities, refugees in forests, bandits in swamps, or wanderers eking out meager lives beyond civilization's edge. These groups were often feared and demonized by settled populations, perpetuating cycles of stigma and violence. Literature and folklore of the era reflect the horror and tragedy of these expulsions. Tales of desperate parents forced to abandon children, of siblings lost in the wild, and of nights spent shivering under open skies haunted the cultural memory. The concept of exile, exilium, carried deep emotional and spiritual weight, symbolizing not just physical banishment, but social and cosmic rupture. As harsh as it was, exile for too many mouths to feed reveals the brutal calculus ancient societies sometimes made when survival hung by a thread. It challenges modern assumptions about community, compassion, and resilience, reminding us that scarcity can break bonds and turn neighbors into enemies. Today, such acts are unthinkable under international laws and human rights. But history shows us the fragility of social contracts under pressure and the devastating human cost when societies fracture in the face of crisis. Remembering these lost families, their pain, and their endurance is crucial. It grounds us in the realities beneath ancient glory and calls us to build societies where no one is discarded simply for being vulnerable. Childhood was over. By age 7. Childhood in the ancient world was a stark contrast to the innocence and leisure many imagine today. From as early as 7 years old, children were no longer sheltered beings of play and imagination, but were thrust into the relentless demands of survival and labor. The idea of a carefree youth, filled with endless games and learning for pleasure, was a luxury few could afford. Instead, childhood was short, cut brutally by necessity, and shaped by the unforgiving realities of agrarian life, economic survival, and social expectation. In societies like ancient Rome and throughout much of the pre-modern world, children were expected to contribute to the household or community as soon as their bodies and minds allowed. By the age of 7, most were considered ready to take on responsibilities that today would seem unimaginable for such young minds and fragile bodies. This was the age when formal education was often limited to the elite. For the majority, school was replaced by apprenticeships, shepherding, and fieldwork. Play was not an entitlement, but a fleeting afterthought, squeezed between the demands of work and the constant vigilance required to survive. The role children played was vital. In rural areas, they tended livestock, sheep, goats, or cattle, tasked with guiding herds to pasture, guarding them from predators, and learning the rhythms of nature. This was not child's play, but an essential duty. The safety of the family's livelihood depended on these young shepherds. Failure could mean starvation. In towns and villages, children were apprenticed to craftsmen and tradesmen, learning skills like weaving, blacksmithing, or pottery from dawn till dusk. These apprenticeships were harsh and demanding, often involving long hours and little leniency. Work was sometimes dangerous. Children carried heavy loads, wielded sharp tools, and endured exposure to the elements. Injury was common, yet their labor was indispensable to the household economy. The concept of childhood as a protected phase of growth was largely absent. Instead, survival and contribution were immediate imperatives. The social structures of the time reinforced this reality. Laws, customs, and family expectations all pushed children into adult roles early. Girls often assisted with domestic chores, caring for younger siblings, preparing food, and managing household tasks. Boys learned trades or agricultural work, preparing to take their place as providers. Education, when available, was practical and vocational rather than academic or recreational. This early induction into labor shaped not just physical growth, but psychological development. Children were conditioned to be resilient, disciplined, and obedient. Their identities intertwined with their roles within the family and community. Childhood was not a protected innocence, but a preparatory stage for the harsh adult world. The consequences were profound. Childhood mortality was high, and those who survived carried burdens from a young age. Emotional expression was often subdued by necessity. Pain and fatigue were met with endurance rather than complaint. Yet within these constraints, families found ways to nurture bonds and moments of joy, though these were fleeting. Understanding this history challenges modern assumptions about childhood. It reveals a world where survival overshadowed leisure, where every member of the family had a role to play in securing life itself. This perspective deepens our appreciation for the protections and freedoms many children experience today, highlighting the long journey of social progress. The story of childhood's brevity in the past is a testament to human adaptability and endurance, reflecting societies shaped by necessity and survival rather than choice. It reminds us that the innocence of youth is often a fragile privilege, one earned over centuries of change. Local lords could demand your daughters for labor. In the shadowed corners of medieval and late antiquity societies, far from the gleaming halls of imperial Rome and the bustling city streets, lay a harsh reality that countless families endured in silence: the exploitation of daughters under the weight of feudal obligations. Local lords, wielding power over land and people, held a brutal prerogative, one that allowed them to demand the service of young girls for domestic labor, often tearing them from their homes and communities. This was not a rare hardship, but a systemic institution, one that left deep scars on families and forever altered the lives of these girls, many of whom never returned to the safety of their families. Feudalism was a complex system of land tenure and mutual obligations. Peasants, or serfs, were bound to the lord's estate, required to provide labor, goods, or money in exchange for protection and the right to farmland. While the exact nature of these duties varied by region and era, one cruel aspect persisted: the right of the Lord to claim the service of peasant laborers, including children. Young girls, seen as extensions of the family's labor force, were particularly vulnerable. From as early as childhood, they could be summoned to work in the Lord's household, cleaning, cooking, sewing, or serving in ways that were grueling and unrelenting. The conditions these girls faced were often grim. Removed from the familiarity of home, language, and kin, they were thrust into environments where abuse, physical, emotional, and sometimes sexual, was common. Lords and their households operated with impunity, and the girls' low social status left them little recourse. Complaints were rarely heard, and even less frequently acted upon. Many girls lived under constant fear, their lives marked by isolation and hardship. Worse still, the promise or hope of return was often illusory. Some girls were kept indefinitely, absorbed into the Lord's household, effectively erased from their birth families. Others were traded, sold, or married off to servants or lesser nobility without their consent. Records and oral histories hint at countless daughters lost to this system, their fates unrecorded but tragically familiar. This practice was not merely a private matter. It was embedded in the legal and social fabric of the time. Lords justified their claims through feudal law and custom, arguing that such service was a rightful part of the peasants' obligations. Peasant families, powerless and dependent on the Lord's protection, had little choice but to comply. Resistance could mean eviction, starvation, or worse. The ties of land and labor were chains that bound daughters as much as fathers. The long-term impact on communities was profound. Families were fragmented. Childhood innocence was stolen. Trust in authority was eroded. The loss of young girls to labor service disrupted family structures and perpetuated cycles of poverty and vulnerability. It also entrenched gendered inequalities, as daughters bore burdens uniquely harsh compared to sons. Yet, even in this darkness, stories of resilience and escape emerged. Some girls found allies within the Lord's household, maids, cooks, or older servants who offered protection or counsel. Others managed to flee or negotiate better conditions, and over centuries, growing critiques of feudal abuses contributed to gradual reforms and the eventual decline of such overt exploitation. Still, the legacy remains a stark reminder of how power, unchecked and unquestioned, can devastate the most vulnerable. When we imagine the medieval world filled with castles, knights, and kings, we must also remember the daughters taken for labor, girls whose names are lost, but whose stories echo through history's silent spaces. Their plight was not mere history. It was human suffering entwined with the structures of power, a cautionary tale of how privilege can devour innocence, and how survival often meant enduring the unbearable. Newborn deaths were so common. They weren't always buried in graves. The arrival of a newborn in ancient and medieval societies was often met with hope and joy, but also with a shadow that loomed heavy and relentless: death. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Newborn deaths were tragically common, a silent plague that haunted families, communities, and entire civilizations. The sheer number of infants lost overwhelmed the capacity of traditional burial grounds. For many poor families, the grief of losing a child was compounded by the impossibility of proper funerals. Instead, babies were often buried in unmarked ground, in hidden corners, or even beneath the floors of their own homes, a haunting testament to the relentless cycle of life and death that shaped human history. The reasons behind this grim reality were many: lack of medical knowledge, poor nutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and rampant diseases all contributed to infant deaths. During epidemics, when sickness ravaged cities and villages alike, the number of deceased overwhelmed the already limited resources of communities. Graveyards, sacred spaces meant for honoring the dead, became crowded beyond capacity. The rituals surrounding death, designed to honor and protect the soul, were often truncated or abandoned. The dead, especially the smallest and most vulnerable, were sometimes hidden away rather than ceremonially laid to rest. For poor families, the burden was even heavier. With few possessions and little influence, they could not secure proper burials for their infants. Sometimes, infants were buried in shallow graves in fields, along roadsides, or in wasteland, places considered outside the sanctity of the community. In other cases, the bodies were interred beneath the family home's floor, in secret, to keep the child close and to avoid attracting unwanted attention. These hidden burials were acts of love and desperation, a way to grieve privately in a world that offered little comfort. The social and religious implications of these practices were profound. Proper burial rites were believed essential for the soul's peace and the family's spiritual welfare. To bury a child in an unmarked or unblessed place risked condemnation, unrestful spirits, or curses. Yet, faced with overwhelming loss and poverty, families had little choice. The community's response was often mixed, compassion for the grief, but also fear and stigma attached to these unofficial graves. Historical records and archaeological findings reveal traces of these hidden infant burials across Europe and the ancient world. Beneath humble dwellings, beneath churches, and scattered across fields lie the remains of countless infants whose lives ended before they could begin. These discoveries have deepened our understanding of the scale of infant mortality and the harsh realities of past lives. They speak to a world where death was omnipresent and where families did their best to cope within impossible circumstances. Epidemics intensified this crisis. Plagues and infectious diseases decimated populations repeatedly, turning infant death from tragedy into an overwhelming crisis. During these times, mass graves and hurried burials became common. The sacred spaces of cemeteries could not contain the dead. Fear of contamination sometimes led communities to isolate burials or to hastily dispose of bodies far from populated areas. The spiritual consequences of such acts added to the collective trauma. The emotional toll on families was devastating. The repeated loss of children shaped family structures, community bonds, and cultural attitudes toward life and death. Parents were forced to mourn again and again, their hopes repeatedly crushed. This cycle of grief and survival influenced everything, from fertility practices to religious beliefs and social customs. The pervasive presence of infant death left scars that history has only recently begun to fully recognize. In literature, art, and oral traditions, the theme of lost children is persistent and poignant. Stories of sorrow, remembrance, and the hope for reunion in the afterlife resonate through centuries. These cultural expressions offer insight into the profound impact of infant mortality on human consciousness and societal development. Today, as we look back on this dark chapter of human history, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the enduring resilience of those who lived through it. The unmarked graves beneath humble homes and in forgotten fields are silent witnesses to a world where death was a constant companion. They challenge us to remember not just the grand narratives of history, but the intimate, painful stories of countless families who loved and lost. Understanding this history is essential, not only to honor those forgotten lives, but to appreciate the advances in medicine, sanitation, and social care that have transformed the fate of newborns worldwide. It reminds us that the comforts we often take for granted are the fruits of centuries of struggle, grief, and perseverance. This story of newborn deaths, hidden burials, and relentless loss is a testament to human endurance amid unimaginable sorrow. It calls us to empathy, to remembrance, and to a deeper awareness of the preciousness of life. Families lived in constant fear of one bad winter. In the ancient world, life was a fragile balance, endlessly tipping between survival and starvation. For families living under the vast skies of Rome and its provinces, one bad winter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. The harvest was everything. When crops failed, entire villages teetered on the edge of collapse, and the people, desperate to save their children, resorted to unimaginable measures. Imagine a cold, gray winter stretching across fields once fertile and abundant. The sun retreats early, the frost bites deep, and the soil refuses to yield its bread. For months, families watch their food stores dwindle, grain bins emptying too fast, and the promise of spring growing distant. In these moments, every morsel counts. Every crumb is precious. Hoarding becomes instinct, but not of fresh bread or meat, of moldy, musty grain, or leather so tough it could barely be chewed. Historical texts and archaeological evidence reveal a grim picture. When food ran out, people boiled leather shoes or hunted tree bark to extract any last nutrients. The bark was scraped and boiled, a thin gruel providing minimal sustenance, but enough to stave off immediate death. Grain molds, dangerous and poisonous by modern standards, were consumed out of dire necessity, despite the risks of sickness or worse. Children, the most vulnerable among them, suffered most deeply. Parents fiercely guarded whatever little food remained for their young, yet many still starved. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making illness inevitable. The ancient medical writers noted seasonal spikes in disease and death, often linked to these brutal winters. But remedies were few, and knowledge of hygiene and nutrition rudimentary at best. Communities lived in perpetual anxiety, aware that a single failed harvest could unravel generations. The fear shaped their entire existence. Families stored surplus grain in hidden pits or underground cellars, hoping to outlast hunger's grip. Yet theft, pests, and spoilage were constant threats. Every winter became a waiting game. Would this be the year the village endured, or the year it broke? The economic and social consequences were profound. Starvation led to migration, abandonment of farms, and sometimes outright revolt. Villagers blamed each other, tensions rising as resources dwindled. The state's response was limited. Grain doles or emergency shipments might arrive in cities, but rural families often faced famine alone. This harsh reality permeated culture and belief. Festivals, prayers, and sacrifices were offered not only for divine favor, but out of sheer desperation. The Saturnalia, while joyous, also marked the darkest months when the struggle for survival was most acute. Myths and stories from the time reflect this fear. Tales of barren fields, specters of famine, and the thin line between life and death. Yet, through it all, families clung to hope. They passed down knowledge of edible plants, preservation methods, and communal sharing. Bonds strengthened in adversity, even as hunger tested the limits of endurance. The struggle of those ancient winters echoes in every corner of history where humanity faces scarcity. Understanding the relentless fear of one bad winter helps us grasp the resilience and vulnerability of ancient societies. It reminds us how food, climate, and survival are intertwined threads in the human story, threads that can unravel even the mightiest civilizations.